Hi guys, my name is Ivo and I'm from mytest.asp.net. As you may already know, in my current video series I'm talking about Entity Framework performance tips. Now I want to explain how change tracking works and how you can use it in cases where you don't need it, so that you can optimize your Entity Framework performance. First, what is change tracking? Change tracking is the functionality from Entity Framework which allows us to write the following code. For example, I can extract a cat and say var cats.first_default. I want cat with some ID, and then I can say cat.name equals to new name, and then I can say save changes. That's change tracking essentially. So every time Entity Framework fetches a model from the database, it tracks its changes. For example, here we're fetching a cat from the database, and when we change something from it, Entity Framework tracks that, and when we go save changes, everything is persisted in the database, so the new change is updated in the data store too. That's essentially change tracking. Entity Framework does change tracking on most of the queries, and if our query, the rule is like the following: if our query fetches a model from the database, for example a cat or an owner in my case, then Entity Framework will track it by default. That's the behavior. But there are times where we don't need tracking. For example, if we do only reading operations, we don't need to make Entity Framework track our changes because we don't have any changes. So essentially, we're introducing an overhead to our code without the need of it. We don't need change tracking in situations where we only read data and use it, for example, for a web response or something else, but we don't change it at all. So it's essentially crucial to turn off change tracking whenever we feel we won't need it. So how to turn off change tracking? By default, this will be tracked. This is a query which will make Entity Framework track all cats which are fetched from the database. I'm essentially making a filter on the cats table. It doesn't matter what the filter is, and I'm making a to list. So all the cats which are returned from the database here will be saved in the change tracker. And now I have prepared a couple of examples to see how change tracking works and how we can turn it off. The first query is just a warm-up query. If you haven't watched my code and warm queries video or my compiled queries video, I suggest you watch it because it explains why I'm calling the query before everything else, before the measurements. Okay, so the first query is just a warm-up, I won't measure it, and the second query is how to make no tracking on a single query. It's essentially the same query. If you want to make a single query to not be tracked by Entity Framework, you can call as no tracking on every iQueryable. For example, here you can call as no tracking, and you will make Entity Framework skip tracking on that particular query. And to see whether the tracking works or not, I have included in each query another line which shows how much entries are tracked in the current DB instance, DB context instance. Essentially, by calling db.changetracker.entries.count, will return all the tracked entries by the current DB context instance. Each time you create a DB context, a new change tracker is created. So essentially, after the using, these tracked entities will not be saved. They will be removed from the garbage collection. So let's run that example and see that when I call no tracking, I have 0 tracked entry. And the performance currently doesn't matter that much because we don't have anything else to compare it. But if I remove no tracking, I will see that this query now has 9,000 tracked entities, which is quite a lot. So we had an overhead in which entity framework had to manually track all these entities. And in a scenario where we just fetch data from the database and then dispose the DB context, we don't need to track the entities. We just have to provide as no tracking. A second way to disable change tracking in our queries is if we disable it on a DB context instance level. On each DB context instance where we don't want to have change tracking, we can call db.changeTracker.queryTrackingBehavior equals to queryTrackingBehavior.noTracking. That allows us to have all the queries that are done in this DB context instance to have no tracking enabled. Keep in mind that if I create another DB context, I will have to disable change tracking again if I don't want it. So essentially this option is per DB context instance. As we can see in my next example, I'm calling the same query without disabling the change tracker, and I will see that it will have a lot of tracked entities. So let's see these 3 examples, how they will perform. First, a query with as no tracking and how much tracked instances we have. Then a query with no tracking on the DB context level. And then a query on which has change tracking enabled. As a side note, I would like to show you how to disable change tracker at all. If you want your DB context to don't have a change tracker, you can disable it in your constructor. This way, all your queries will not have change tracking enabled, but keep in mind that may be dangerous. So you must know what you're doing if you want to disable it in all queries in your application. In my opinion, this is the best way to disable change tracking. You may disable it only on the queries you feel like you won't need it. Okay, let's run these 3 and see what happens. In the first query, no tracking per query, I have 0 tracked entities and the performance is 0.08 seconds. In the second example, I have again 0 tracked entities because I disabled the change tracking on the DB context instance level, and I have 0.04 seconds as performance, and when I have 9,000 tracked entities, I have 0.11 seconds, which essentially, when I have change tracking enabled, I have 30% more performance issues. So I have 1/3 optimization when I disable change tracking. Now, don't be confused, because it doesn't matter whether you're going to use as no tracking or no tracking at all, because if I switch this if I switch these two operations, and if I first disable the query tracking by the DB context instance level and then I call as no tracking, I will see the same result as before. As you can see, again, the first query is slower, the second one is faster, but I have 30% better performance when I disable the change tracking, and 30% is quite a lot. So it doesn't matter whether you're going to disable the change tracking from the DB context or from the query, and the difference between the two queries is between these two queries, and why the second one performs better is because SQL Server caches the query too. So essentially I'm calling SQL Server with one query and then I'm calling SQL Server with the same query, so he decides to cache it. For me, that's why it's faster. So here we have a SQL Server cache that is playing along with our disabled change tracking. But we can see that if we have tracked entities, the performance is always slower. So it's a good idea to be mindful about the change tracker when you write your queries. Okay, now I'm going to talk about change tracking in projections, because if you watched my previous videos, you know that you should always use a select statement, because here we don't have a select, here we don't have a select, and essentially we are not following best practices here. So if we decide to follow best practices, we need to understand where we have change tracking and when to disable it. But first, I would like to thank my sponsors. If you're following my videos, you know that I'm creating open source ASP.NET Core libraries, and my libraries are allowing you to assert your web applications in very cool and fast way by using strongly typed Fluent API. You can test your controller services, models, database caching session, and many more. If you are currently writing ASP.NET Core web applications, you may consider my project. And since the project is developed during my free time, I will be very happy if you decide to support me. You may support me in whatever manner you want. You may share my projects on social media, you may start the project, or you may become a sponsor or backer on Patreon and Open Collective. One-time donations are also accepted. Some people already supported me, which is quite great. Thank you guys. And if your company is looking for more exposure, I'm showing all my sponsors during my videos. Current sponsors are SoftUni, Smart IT, and Noble Hire. Thank you guys, you truly rock. Now let's get back to the code and see the other examples when we use tracking with projection. Okay, so I hope you understood how change tracking is enabled by default and how you can disable it to improve your query performance. Now let's see when change tracking is included when we're doing a select projection. Essentially, the rule is as follows. If you have a data model which Entity Framework uses in the projection and it's saved, it will be tracked. If you don't have a data model, it won't be tracked. For example, in this select, I have an ID, a name, and the owner's name. Essentially, I'm not fetching a full data entity, so Entity Framework will not track anything from this query. Change tracking is disabled here, so essentially I don't need to go as no tracking. If your select statements include only what you need and you never get a domain model from your database, you most probably won't need to disable change tracking. The second example is where I make a projection and I include a data model. Here I include an owner, which is essentially a data model from my database. In this case, Entity Framework will track all the owners here. So I will have a lot of tracked entities in my change tracker, and if I want to improve that, I will need to go as no tracking here so that I am receiving no tracked entities. Let's run the example and see how it behaves. We can see that tracking in projection without a data model has 0 tracked entities when I don't fetch a data model from the database. I just fetched the owner's name. So it doesn't track anything even when I don't specify as no tracking. As you can see, Entity Framework does not track anything here. In the second example, where I'm tracking in a projection, when I'm using a projection with a data model, here I'm calling an owner. So essentially I'm fetching the whole owner from the database. Entity Framework starts tracking it. The change tracker has 8,000 entities and the performance is 0.14 seconds. This query can be improved because essentially I'm not needing these owners to be tracked, because after the query I'm disposing the DB context and essentially I'm disposing the change tracking entities, so I don't need to track that. And to remove the tracking, I just need to go as no tracking on the same query where I'm fetching the whole owner, and the results are way better. My query is improved by quite a lot, almost 60-70%. So it's essentially to be mindful about the change tracking in Entity Framework and how you can improve it. Because when I call the same projection with the data model but I disabled change tracking, I received 0.05 seconds and 0 tracked entities as a result. So it's better. That's, I believe, all about change tracking you need to know. Keep in mind, change tracking is helpful when we need to update entities, but when we don't need to do anything with the fetched entities, change tracking may hinder our performance in our application. So make sure to be mindful about it and to disable it when you don't need it. It will improve your queries a lot. And another thing you should follow is to always use a select and use a projection. Just fetch the data you need. In this case, most of the time you won't need to disable change tracking like in this query, because Entity Framework does not have a data model to track, so nothing is change tracked. I would like to conclude this video by saying that if you liked it, hit the thumbs up button or leave a comment below. And again, if you're developing ASP.NET Core web applications, make sure you check my projects, and if you really like my content, consider becoming a backer on Patreon. I will be extremely thankful. Bye.